Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
President Trump extends the ceasefire, but the strait is still closed. Welcome to the Wednesday edition of Balance of Power. As the double blockade of the Strait of Hormuz continues now, and Iran's Revolutionary Guard firing now at a third ship in the strait. I'm Joe Mathieu, alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. Kailey, the president telling the New York Post by phone, ceasefire should be extended by another 3 to 5 days, but it's unclear when they will meet again.
Yeah, there's nothing on the books. And of course, he suggested the ceasefire is extended so that Iran can submit a new proposal and that negotiations can reach some kind of conclusion. But it isn't abundantly clear where Iran is on all of this, whether or not they're even agreeing to an extension. So far, in large part, this is one-sided. And as you allude to, Joe, Iran's still active in the Strait of Hormuz, making sure effectively that that waterway is not safe to transit, seizing 2 vessels in addition to those it fired on. And interesting as we consider the U.S. naval blockade, Senator Lindsey Graham, the Republican who, of course, is close to President Trump, especially on this issue, says he spoke to the president and the defense secretary earlier today and suggested that not only will the blockade stay in place, he thinks it will be growing and could become global soon.
You wonder if that means allies joining us in the strait or, in fact, other bodies of water being blockaded used by Iran. It sounds more like the latter, Kailey, and that's something that we're going to talk about with Colonel Wayne Sanders from Bloomberg Intelligence. He's going to join us a bit on the strategy here. We'll get an update from Tyler at the White House as well.
And, of course, we have to get an update on the markets. And a lot of stocks within this market are actually moving on news from out of Washington. Marijuana rescheduling, that's another big one. Apparently is what we're going to be focused on today, and potentially a rescue of Spirit Airlines coming from this administration. So let's get a check on all of those related stocks and the wider markets as we turn to Charlie Pellet in New York.
Hi, thank you very much. And got to begin there. Weed and airplanes. Right now, we are looking at big gains for the marijuana ETF, MJ on the ticker. Up, that's the Amplify Alternative Harvest ETF, by the way. It is surging now by 18.3%. Another weed ETF, the Advisor Shares Pure U.S. Cannabis ETF, MSOS on the ticker, up now by 24.5%. Again, a developing story, one we are watching. A source tells Bloomberg the Justice Department is expected to reclassify marijuana into a less restrictive federal category as soon as today. As for airlines, a source tells Bloomberg the Trump administration is close to reaching a financial rescue package for embattled Spirit Aviation Holdings. Right now, we're looking at Spirit shares, FLYYQ on the ticker, up 193%. Rival Frontier Group Holdings that uses the ticker ULCC is an ultra low-cost carrier. It is moving lower on that news by 11.9%. We've got a slew of strong corporate profits. That is lifting stocks to right now. Big gains for the S&P, in fact, trading close to a record, 71.19. The record, 71.26, up 55 right now. Gain there of 0.8%. The Dow will round that up to 300 points, up 0.6%. NASDAQ up 295 now, up 1.2%. All of this with the VIX just above 19, the 10-year 4.29%, and spot gold right now climbing by $13 the ounce, up by about 0.3%. Crude, interesting day because we got crude oil advancing. Crude oil is surging right now by 4%, 93.26 a barrel. Stocks are advancing, and Brent 101.95, barrel of Brent up by just about 3.5%. Briefly, the CFA Institute's former chief marketing officer has pleaded guilty to embezzling almost $6 million from the Financial Education Group and another company. Joe and Kailey, that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet with the latest on the markets. Thank you so much. Clearly a lot of movers today that are DC-oriented, from the airlines to the pot stocks, as we await further news on that front from others in the administration. Of course, all of this right now is via sources familiar with the matter. We did hear directly, though, from the president on Truth Social a short time ago, and this does pertain to Iran, though not the ceasefire. He says that he has just been informed that 8 women protesters who were going to be executed tonight in Iran will no longer be killed. He said 4 will be released immediately, 4 will be sentenced to 1 month in prison. He says he very much appreciates that Iran and its leaders respected his request and terminated the planned execution. But as with other instances pertaining to this ongoing conflict with Iran, Joe, this is just President Trump saying this at this point. We still await confirmation from Iran, not only only on this particular issue and these 8 women, but also on the idea of an extended ceasefire and whether or not we're going to see negotiations put on the books in the coming days.
Another reporter got a phone call into the president today, I guess from the New York Post. He said 3 to 5 days, but it's pretty clear that they are figuring this out as we speak and in real time, with Iran accusing the United States of continuing to violate the ceasefire through our own blockade that has now been in place for days. Though, as Rick Davis reminds us, a couple of dozen Iranian vessels have managed to get through the strait despite the U.S. blockade. And as we've noted as well, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard has been firing on ships as well. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall ahead of our conversation with Colonel Wayne Sanders. She's live on the North Lawn of the White House. What's the latest from the administration on all of this, Tyler? If it's not going to be in 3 to 5 days, then what?
Right, Joe, at this point, it's been actually a relatively quiet day here at the White House. President Trump does have 3 closed-door policy meetings today, including one during the late edition of Balance of Power at 5:30 p.m. Eastern. So we'll be watching to see if any of these open up to the press, because we have a lot of questions about the duration of this ceasefire. And if it is, according to reports, for the next 3 to 5 days, would the White House ramp up its escalation? As we previously heard, the president threaten that if Iran does not come to the table, then he could strike civilian infrastructure. But at this point, the line from this White House has been one of de-escalation, that President Trump was extending this ceasefire deal in order to give Iran some more time to come to the table with a proposal for the U.S. to review. But as you've been discussing, one of the key sticking points here is that Iranian officials have repeatedly said that they don't want another round of talks until the U.S. stops its naval blockade. And at this point, this White House is holding firm that it's going to continue. In fact, we got an update from CENTCOM overnight saying that they have turned around at least 28 vessels that have tried to transit between the ports. And the thing is, we're seeing escalation here from Iran, appearing to test the limits of this blockade. You guys were just discussing how reports earlier today indicated that Iranian gunboats fired at least 3 vessels, and then we saw an additional 2 vessels apparently be seized by the IRGC, according to Iranian state media. And then, as we're discussing, some new headlines just hitting the terminal from the Washington Post that Iran may have placed 20 or more mines in and around Hormuz. That is only going to complicate matters further in terms of trying to get that waterway reopened.
Wow.
Yeah, it certainly is a sticky situation, and it's unclear whether or not we're getting any closer to its resolution at this point, Tyler, as you ran us through. I do want to ask you on some other news that is percolating out there today, specifically when it comes to marijuana reclassification, as Bloomberg is confirming an earlier report in Axios that the DOJ is considering moving it to Schedule 3 from Schedule 1. What should we know about this, and do we expect that the president could be announcing this sometime soon?
Well, Kailey, our reporting indicates that this could come as soon as tomorrow. Not necessarily surprising, right? We have to keep in mind that President Trump had signed an executive order earlier directing this process to begin in terms of a reclassification. Now, the backdrop here is that there is a push by the administration to study marijuana's medicinal purposes, how to use it in a medical setting, and that's really what we would see happen in terms of a potential reclassifying of the substance. Now, importantly, we should say this isn't going to immediately legalize marijuana, or is it going to change this the sentences for those that have already been incarcerated because of possession of marijuana. But it does mark a major step from the administration that could potentially come within days in terms of how marijuana would be reclassified. We can say, though, that our own analysts at Bloomberg Intelligence are raising questions about, we won't get too much into the wonkiness, but whether or not a new rule is going to have to be written completely, which could potentially open this up to lawsuits. As you both know, it often takes time here in Washington for changes to actually be put on the books.
All right. Indeed, we do know that. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live on the North Lawn of the White House for us. Thank you so much. And we want to return to the ceasefire with Iran that, of course, has been extended. At least the U.S. says it has been extended, though clearly there is a lot of activity in the Strait of Hormuz in the last 24 hours that suggests that tensions are high and there is still evidence of hostilities. So for more, we turn to Colonel Wayne Sanders, who's Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Defense Research Analyst. Colonel, always good to have you on Bloomberg TV and radio. If we have the maintenance of a U.S. naval blockade and Iran firing on ships, if not outright seizing them, as we have seen instances of both just in the last day, is this really a ceasefire? Can we credibly call it that?
Yeah, I think one of the important pieces here is you have to look at the rest of the landscape as well. When you look at ballistic missiles and drone strikes, right, those are still at zero, and they have been for a little while. We were averaging somewhere between 70 and 150 per day, prior to the ceasefire. So that's probably my largest indicator and warning that right now we're still sitting in an okay place. Right now, both the United States as well as Iran are looking at how can I operate militarily in order to still gain leverage in the region during this type of negotiation, right? And so they've pretty much just restricted it down to the Straits of Hormuz. So the IRGC fast boats, obviously that was in response to the fact that we had fired some shots into the engine room of an Iranian flagged tanker. That was part of the CENTCOM turning around of 28 ships, as Tyler mentioned earlier. And then looking at the other side, though, there have been no confirmed reports of Iran getting through from CENTCOM, right? We've seen some of this reporting that's out there. So IRGC is doing their part, as well as the U.S. Navy on their side. So they're operating within the box, so they keep it away from escalating to the point of opening it back up.
Well, interesting, Colonel. The reporting today from the Washington Post would be troubling to the energy markets today. 3 officials speaking on condition of anonymity, Tyler just mentioned this, say that lawmakers were briefed, Congress briefed by the Pentagon, that Iran may have placed 20 or more mines in and around the Strait of Hormuz. And the Pentagon is informing Congress that it could take 6 months now to fully clear the strait, and any such operation would be unlikely carried out until after the U.S. war with Iran ends. Is that a timeline we need to start getting our heads around?
Yeah, I was actually surprised to hear about that timeline. Right now, the USS Frank Peterson Jr., as well as the USS Michael Murphy, as well as uncrewed surface vessels are actively trying to clear the straits from mines. This is something that's been going on. They continue to do this to make sure that there is freedom in there. When Iran is going through and dropping some of these, what I'm seeing is some of these things are done very hastily. And so some of these are considered drifting mines. Well, the problem you put those into the straits is even Iran could have lost track of where some of these things are. So I think at this point in time, that is probably the very conservative side in terms of making sure that we see each and every one of these. But in terms of intelligence, surveillance, and radar capability for the U.S. Navy, this is going to be a top priority to make sure that they can find those. If they're floating on the surface, they'll be seen and taken care of at that point. And then you're going to continue to see movement from the U.S. Navy to make sure that this area is clear.
On the subject of the Navy, Colonel, when we consider the cost of this war, which to this point is something of an unknown quantity, we aren't sure of the number, could be $1 billion a day in aggregate. We aren't sure now that to the point you were making earlier, when we aren't actively conducting aerial strikes, I would imagine that the number is lower. But if we are still maintaining a naval blockade of this size, what kind of assets come with that? And what kind of spending could be ongoing just for stasis, just to maintain our current posture?
So an aircraft carrier is about $10 billion a day, $10 million a day just to be able to float. Okay. So one of the key pieces to make sure that we understand is the Navy already, no matter whether it's sitting in the Persian Gulf or whether it's sitting off of Norfolk, Virginia, doesn't make a difference. It already comes with some operating and maintenance costs that are associated. So one of the research pieces we put out is we were thinking about $15 to $20 billion per month is what you would be looking at for almost a steady state operation, with 20 to 30 billion in a surge capacity, which includes a lot of the airstrikes. So I don't think we've seen that piece of it, but remember the logistics tail that has to go along. It's not just your aircraft carriers. It's not just your cruisers and your frigates. It's nuclear-powered submarines. It's also then all of those logistics vessels that have to be able to refuel, be able to rearm. That goes a part of that military military sea lift command underneath the U.S. Navy. So all of that piece, if we were to surge and go back up, we're probably looking closer to 20 to 30 billion a month. But in this time right now, it's still just a blockade, and a lot of that operation and maintenance cost will continue to stay pretty much even.
As we spend time with Colonel Wayne Sanders from Bloomberg Intelligence, just want to let everyone know that we're also standing by for a conversation with Jim Esposito, the president, Citadel Securities, at the Bloomberg Global Markets Banking Summit. That's going to start just a couple of minutes from now. Colonel, as I look deeper into this report about mining, it does make you wonder how we got this far. Some of the mines are believed to have been laid by Iranian forces using small boats, and we've talked a lot about these small attack boats that are lining the strait. But others were floated remotely, the Post says, using GPS technology. Is that why we have not noticed them being laid in the strait?
It could be, but remember, I mean, we still have satellite imagery all over that area. So when I think about where the U.S. Navy is placing these, if it is a drifting mine, it's something that's easier to be able to just throw overboard and then hope that it's going. But if you're looking at some of the more sophisticated ones that you would expect, these are mooring mines that you have to make sure they are anchored and then they stay below the surface of the water. And why that's important is it takes time to do that, and these are fairly large. So, yes, you have capability to be able to throw one over the side. But if you're trying to look for an effective deterrent in that, right now, I think it's more about the messaging than it is about the actual explosive impact of one of these mines against a tanker in the Straits.
So when we consider not just the mines, but Iran's capability overall, knowing the president has consistently heralded the U.S. military to use, in his words, destroying their Navy. He says they have no Navy. Are we learning, Wayne, given the events we've seen just over the last day with the firing on vessels, Iran seizing 2 vessels, taking them to Iranian shores, that they don't need the formal Navy necessarily, that they are able to exert this kind of military authority and make it unsafe for transit via small craft that the U.S. may not have targeted yet? I just wonder how the U.S. realistically can address that.
Oh, absolutely. And it's the age-old tale, right? When you're looking at a conventional powerhouse like the United States in the military side of the house versus an asymmetric threat like Iran is presenting right now. We've taken out their conventional mine-laying capability. We've taken out their Navy. We've taken out their submarines. We've taken out those specific pieces that are tied to a conventional force. So Iran has turned around and looked at the asymmetric side of the house and be like, if I still have a handful of these IRGC fast boats, and I have the ability to interdict a handful of them and make it so that people do not want to go into that decision calculus and say, do I want to try and run the strait? And so Iran is able to do quite a bit with not a whole lot of firepower. We talked earlier about even shoulder-fired missiles from the shore. So you don't have to have, especially if you're looking at something dealing with a lot of escort requirements for these tankers, is that it is something that requires a significant amount of capability, military escorts. You brought up earlier in the discussion, too, about, a coalition. President Macron had brought up 40 different countries that potentially want to get involved in that. Well, that's probably one of the things that would be required if you're trying to provide almost a guarantee into that space against that type of asymmetric threat, is you need a very large naval capability to provide that level of escort.
Colonel, we thank you as always. Colonel Wayne Sanders has been indispensable in helping us understand what's happening on the ground and in the air in the Middle East. We thank you as always. Find him on the terminal and online with some of the best analysis out there. Kailey mentioned the breaking news story that landed just in the last hour or so. The administration is going to move forward with the reclassification, the rescheduling, to be more specific, of cannabis, which is an ongoing story and one that brings us to last week when the president was in the Oval Office with Joe Rogan signing an executive order to start conducting testing on some psychedelic substances. Nathan Dean joins us right now from Bloomberg Intelligence, having spent many months and years covering this whole process and has been hearing from a lot of investors who've been looking for a way forward on this. Nathan, it appears to finally be happening. This has been long in the making, to the point where President Trump last Friday in that event said they're slow walking me on rescheduling. So what changed?
So I think this was the president essentially telling the Department of Justice to move forward here. And it's really interesting to see what happens over the next day or so, because, obviously this report says that they're going to reclassify marijuana. We don't disagree with that. We actually think reclassification is coming. But it's important to know that, at least on the specifics, are they moving straight to a final rule, or are they restarting the process that's largely been delayed? And this is the process of going through an administrative hearing, having more comment periods. It's really important to note. So if we get this final rule and say it comes out tomorrow, President Trump has sort of skipped a lot of the process here. And that's why we think it will actually open up to lawsuits. Now, these lawsuits we still have to see what courts and so forth will say, but it could open it up to lawsuits. So, if you get this situation, though, where President Trump says, I'm just ordering the DOJ to restart the process, then reclassification is still months, if not quarters away.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you, Nathan, is what kind of timeline realistically that would be if the president wants this to happen immediately. Would you be surprised if he, as he has done in many other instances on many other issues, to just try to do what he can immediately and see if it holds up in court? Because that's how a lot of things have gone in this administration.
That's a great question. I wouldn't discount that scenario as well, because we have the midterm elections here, and there's a lot of people in this space that think that this is obviously an election move as well, something to do in advance of the midterm elections. So in that scenario, if President Trump comes out and says, here's a final rule, that would most likely be effective probably within 30 to 90 days. And our analysis that my colleague Ken Shea is putting on the terminal as we speak shows that the tax relief for these marijuana companies drops from about 40% down to about 8 to 10%. It's called 280E tax relief. And we actually think it will spur M&A in the sector. These are very small companies, and so as a result, there's pretty significant volatility swings here. Now, the lawsuits can't come until there's a final rule. So if there is a lawsuit, it will probably be this fall, and then that will play out through the court system, and that would be months, if not years. If they decide to restart the process and they go back to an administrative hearing, then you're probably looking 9 months on the quick side for reclassification after the midterms, up to another 12 to 18 months for a final rule.
This is great analysis. This is why they call Nathan to find out. Looking at the reaction in the pot stocks that you always say have hot sauce on them, Nathan, the MSOS, which is the Advisor Shares Pure U.S. Cannabis ETF, is up 27% right now. It's trading above $5. For a little perspective, this thing topped out in 2021 in the low to mid 40s. So we've got a long way to go to get back there. Curaleaf is up over 30%. Tilray is up 17%. These are investors who have been burned before. And we also have to acknowledge what this does not do, Nathan. This would not give these cannabis companies access to banking services, correct?
That's absolutely correct. And when you talk about the equities, it's important to note that if you see the Canadian marijuana companies, they're moving up just as well as the American companies here. Yeah. And this does not apply to the Canadian entities whatsoever. So there is a little bit of retail sentiment that's bleeding into the Canadian equity portion of this. Now, when it comes to pot banking in particular, this does not make it federally legal, nor does this really change how banks are going to operate towards marijuana businesses. There's a bill out there called the Safe Banking Act. It really hasn't had any momentum in this Congress, and we don't think it's going to actually come back or pass. So what happens here is that these companies, yes, there's additional M&A opportunities, and they get a lower tax relief, but really what they want is the ability to get into institutional or get institutional investment here, and that's really not what's going to happen. I mean, marijuana is a very tough business, and big tobacco companies have been very, I'd say hesitant to get into this space, because when you tax something, you put a more regulations on it and so forth like that, it makes it a costly product. And when you're competing against stuff that people can just get off the street, it's a very difficult business here. So even though that this is a win if it moves forward, it's certainly a win for the marijuana industry, and it gives additional color towards that idea of legalization. We just don't think legalization is something in the cards for the next 3 to 5 years. It's going to remain at the state level.
All right, well, we're going to have to continue to watch this space, just as Nathan Dean always does, joining us from Bloomberg Intelligence. We appreciate it, Nathan. As always, he's had this covered, as Joe mentioned, for quite some time and will continue to do so. But as Joe also mentioned, we were waiting an important conversation that's taking place at the Bloomberg Global Markets and Banking Summit, where Jim Esposito, the president of Citadel Securities, is speaking now. Let's listen live on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Maybe some of the traditional banks. We have some of what I think is the greatest collection of quantitative researching talent embedded in the four walls of Citadel Securities, but make no mistake about it, the quants themselves are incredibly quirky. They have some very unusual hobbies and interests, and I find myself really connecting with them, just getting them to open up and talk about the things they like to do outside of the office. And so I feel like I found my tribe there. There's more quirky people there than in my former firm, and I'm really enjoying that.
Your new bosses, Ken Griffin and Peng Zhao, hired you 18 months ago to make Citadel Securities as dominant in block trading and in credit as it is in retail equities and U.S. rates. I would say no small undertaking. How's it going?
Yeah, look, I'd say I'm now about 18 months into my role at Citadel Securities, and many of you have seen us broadening and deepening our client franchise. Now, as you suggested, when I got there, we were already dominant in the electronic execution channel. Across global equities and fixed income, we are now equally focused on building out a high-touch effort to really build deeper and more senior relationships with clients. I'd say it's going well, and I'll just take you through a couple of statistics. We're broadening out our product suite in fixed income. You look at the rates markets globally, we now rank top 3 in U.S. Treasuries, dollar interest rate swaps, and investment grade credit, a business we stood up less than 2 years ago. We're in the top 5. And then to your point, in global equities, we were already executing, and I find this kind of a mind-blowing stat, we were already executing more equity flow on a daily basis than any other competitor on the planet. On any given day at Citadel Securities, we execute close to 25% of daily U.S. equity volumes. We represent about a third of the volume on the New York Stock Exchange. I look at our listed equity options business. Year to date, we send out something like 35 to 40 billion option quotes into the market. And we're accomplishing all of that with only 1,900 professionals. So the breadth and the scale is impressive, but the way we lever technology and just how few, headcount, how little headcount we have, I think really sets us apart from some of the traditional bank market makers.
My colleague here at Bloomberg, Kat Doherty, reported yesterday that JP Morgan stopped sending pieces of its big equity orders to Citadel Securities because you're now competing with one another. Is that true?
Well, factually, it is true, but maybe this is a little bit circular, so let's go through it. Previously, Citadel Securities was very active. We were a large participant executing equity blocks. However, we weren't sourcing those at the initial origination point directly from institutional investors. So formally, if a large global asset manager wanted to trade an equity block, they would call up one of the big banks. Let's assume one of those big banks like JP Morgan got hit on that block. JP Morgan would then call Citadel Securities, and we would take a piece of that block from one of the bank partners. What I found as I joined Citadel Securities and I made the round, seeing large, sophisticated clients, they kept saying to us, Citadel Securities has liquidity that we can't access. That's the retail liquidity you referenced. By the way, we're 35 to 40% of U.S. retail volumes. The traditional players aren't involved at all in retail. Clients want to interact directly with that retail liquidity. We have this very significant on-exchange market-making presence. Again, the traditional players are no longer represented trading on exchange. Clients wanted access to that liquidity. They thought it was a little odd to get to us. They had to come through another player. And so we decided, based on those client demands and client needs, we would stand up this new high-touch equity business. We've only been at it for a couple of months, and I'm really pleased to report, it's hard to get the exact data, but I suspect we rank already top 3 executing equity blocks, and we've only been at it for a couple of months. So what we're finding is, our capabilities risk managing large flows of equity and fixed income products fits this high touch effort. What we were so good at executing medium and small size trades, we have the same capabilities to execute blocks. Now we're pairing that together, and I think clients are really delighting in that experience.
I would imagine, though, that you still need.
That's Jim Esposito, the president of Citadel Securities, speaking at the Bloomberg Global Markets and Banking Summit. We just wanted to put an ear on that conversation for you because you won't hear it anywhere else. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. Thanks for being with us on the Wednesday edition of Balance of Power. One major political story we have not yet touched today brings us directly to the midterm campaign trail and the issue of redistricting, more specifically in the state of Virginia. This is, of course, a process that began with President Trump's call for Texas to redraw its congressional maps. It then went national when Gavin Newsom decided to pursue the same end to try to keep the numbers even. In California, other states have weighed in, and now Virginia voters have approved a referendum to draw new congressional maps there as well. That could add as many as 4 Democratic seats to the House of Representatives. There are many wondering if in the end this entire exercise will be a wash because Florida has yet to weigh in. But right now, Virginia gives Democrats an advantage of 1 seat on a national level. And we wanted to hear from our panel on this. Bloomberg Politics contributors Jeanne Zaino and Rick Davis are with us now. Jeanne is our Democratic analyst and democracy visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center. Rick is a Republican strategist, partner at Stonecourt Capital. So you got it done, Jeanne, and it was a close one. It was just 51% of the vote that went with Democrats, who far outspent Republicans. Will this end up being a wash in the end?
It very likely could. As you said, we're still waiting for Florida. But I think for Democrats in particular, putting aside whether they end up with +1 seats like they may have now or it's a wash, I think the Democratic Party has given the base what it has long been asking for. And I think it was all encapsulated by Hakeem Jeffries last night, who said essentially what I think of as the new mantra for the base, which is that when they go low, we hit back. Quite a change from Michelle Obama's when they go low, we go high. Mm-hmm. And that is something the base has been asking for. So it's a win from that perspective. But numbers wise, I've always thought this thing was probably going to end up a wash. Gerrymandering is tricky business. You can't assume you know the outcome.
Well, and when we consider the idea that you can't assume you know the outcome, Rick, even if we look at the map that they redrew in Texas or the one they could redraw in Florida, they were making certain assumptions about the 2024 voting coalition that elected President Trump that seems now like it isn't really fully intact. So whether you're Texas, thinking about whether these seats are actually going to be more likely Republican than not, or Florida, wondering if you want to go down the path that Texas did and assuming you can maintain a certain portion of the Latino vote, how carefully would you be treading here?
Yeah, when the president kicked off these redistricting wars, Kailey, he had this concept in mind that he'd cut into Democrat support amongst Latinos and Hispanic voters, young people, independent voters. None of that seems to be apparent today. So as you say, you take really hardcore Republican districts in Texas and you have to thin them out a little bit, put some Democratic constituencies in there because you got to make up some new Republican districts. And what you've done is you basically take 5 districts, you make them 10. But none of them are as powerful as they once were as far as Republican voters, especially with the flight of these traditionally Democratic constituencies. And I don't know if it's actually even. I mean, like the point Jeanne made was maybe on paper and districts changing. But I think if you had to look at all these districts combined and the kind of numbers that the president has going into midterm elections, you'd have to say not only is the actual structural redistricting a wash, but you've now created probably a dozen Republican seats that could be flipped wherein they wouldn't have done before.
Well, to that end, Jeanne, Alex Conant said before, but a Republican strategist from Firehouse earlier in the program, that while this may not help Democrats or Republicans, if this is a wash, that it might help America by creating more purple districts, more competition for elected office. Is there any truth to that?
I agree. We do need more competition for office, but mid-decade redistricting is not the way we need to get that done. We need to rethink the way that we run our elections. And, I think this issue of buyer's remorse, we are hearing that in Texas from some people on the right who are as concerned about exactly what Rick was just describing. And also, as we look at Florida, I mean, Governor DeSantis has called for this special session to think about redistricting, could get them maybe 2 to 3 seats. But you hear from people who say, look at how Florida elections and special elections and local elections have gone, even Donald Trump's home district. And you've got to scratch your head and wonder, even if they redraw the map, are they really going to end up with 2 or 3 more seats? Or are they at risk of losing even more? So you may see some buyer's remorse. I mean, if I was in the GOP, I would say, hold off, Governor DeSantis. I don't think it's a good time to be doing this in Florida right now.
I guess we'll see what Governor DeSantis decides. Jeanne, Sheenan, Zaino, Rick Davis, Bloomberg Politics contributors, both of them, thank you, as always, for being our political panel today as we track the redistricting news in Virginia and, of course, tracking a lot of other news on this Wednesday, specifically in regard to the ceasefire in Iran, which President Trump has said is extended until Iran submits a proposal for a new deal. No news on whether or not Iran has done so, whether it intends to do so. Joe, frankly, we haven't heard that much from the various factions within the Iranian power structure right now.
That's for sure. 3 to 5 days, says the president, but we have no sense really of when the next round of talks might happen. We'll keep tabs on this for you. Much more ahead on Balance of Power, live from Washington on Bloomberg.
I'm Kailey Leinz alongside Joe Mathieu here in Washington. Thanks for being with us on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, where we've been tracking a lot of breaking news today. And frankly, we were tracking a lot of breaking news yesterday as well, whether it was from the ceasefire extension that President Trump announced when it comes to Iran, or, of course, the news that crossed late in the 5 o'clock hour that Bloomberg exclusively reported that unauthorized users had gained access to Mythos. Of course, this is Anthropic's new AI model that was deemed so dangerous that they were only releasing it to a small group of companies and users. In fact, the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and the Fed Chair Jerome Powell actually convened the leaders of banks in Washington earlier this month to talk about the cybersecurity risks specifically that this model could pose. And yet, Joe, given all of the hype around the danger of this and how carefully restricted Anthropic wanted to treat this model, apparently a group of private users were able to gain access to it.
Yeah, I want to know more about who this is. I think we all do, of course. Unauthorized users said to be hobbyists when we spoke with Mike Shepard last night. And ahead of our conversation with the representative from Rhode Island, we're going to talk to Seth Magaziner in a moment, who's not only on Homeland Security, but the subcommittee on counterterrorism. Let's get the latest on this. Shep is back with us right now in our Washington studios here. Do we have a better sense of who these hobbyists are?
We don't. We did manage to talk to people who were familiar with this and also see some of the documentation kind of backing up the idea that a third party without authorization from Anthropic had gained access to Mythos, which, as Kailey noted at the top, was really restricted in its release to only a handful of big trusted users. And that would include tech companies like Amazon and big Wall Street banks like JP Morgan. And the idea is that they would use Mythos, which has, superpowers in terms of detecting network vulnerabilities, to check their own systems for any gaps and try to patch them. And one of the reasons they don't want to let Mythos out into the wild to just any user is that in the wrong hands, it could go from being a tool to detect network vulnerabilities, to patch them, to being one used to find them and wreak some havoc. And what, from our understanding, though, Joe, is this group really, hobbyists may be, kind of our, own joking way of referring to them, but they are people who have a Discord channel where they talk about finding out things about unreleased models. They're just curious about what AI models might be coming next. And they used kind of a guessing game to figure out how to get into Mythos, and did so on the day that Anthropic made its announcement.
Well, but if they could do so, even if they didn't have nefarious intentions, is that not a signal, Mike, that someone with nefarious intentions could do the very same thing? How do we know they haven't already?
Well, it sure is, Kailey, and that is one of the big questions. And that if a group of people who kind of do this as a pastime or an interest or a passion would do it, if it's a state-sponsored actor or one of the criminal gangs known to really seek to hack full-time for the wrong reasons, this is very easily something that they too could try to do. And it also raises questions about how Anthropic has taken measures or what steps they have taken to try to fence off more securely this technology that they have really tried to keep from a lot of different users, including U.S. government agencies. And we know that there have been discussions between the company and the White House and U.S. government officials about granting that access, but so far we're not seeing evidence that it really has been on a wider scale, because the U.S. government, of course, has so many agencies with so many networks, and we've known in the past from experience that they have been riddled with their own vulnerabilities.
Shep, thank you so much. Jumping in repeatedly on this breaking news story. Bloomberg's Mike Shepard live in Washington. It is not lost on us, by the way, Kailey, that cyber stocks are going up today. CrowdStrike is up almost 3%, $12. Palo Alto up over 2%. Almost $4, as we get our heads around the idea of cybersecurity may not be gobbled by AI, but might be required because of AI. And we want to bring in, as I mentioned, Congressman Seth Magaziner, who's joining us, the Democrat from Rhode Island, is on the House Committee on Homeland Security, and also ranking member, the top Democrat on the subcommittee on counterterrorism, law enforcement, and intelligence. Congressman, it's great to have you with us as part of our conversation today on Bloomberg TV and radio. We want to ask you about Iran. We want to ask you about reconciliation, but this Anthropic story is clearly a big one, and the urgent threat of cyber attacks against the country exacerbated now potentially by the war with Iran. Is it time for a framework, a standard of regulations in controlling AI on behalf of Congress, or should that be a state issue?
Yes, it is time. So advanced artificial intelligence has the ability to help us improve the world dramatically, but also has the ability to help us throw the world into chaos. And so it is time for a more proactive federal policy. Number one, to ensure that AI products are safe before they go to market. Number two, to make sure that we maintain our competitive edge against China in particular. And number three, to do what we can to help workers whose jobs may be displaced from the rise of AI. Look, Anthropic is doing the right thing here, and I give them credit. Not only are they winning the technology race, but they have done the right thing by voluntarily being cautious and warning key players, warning the world about what they have discovered before releasing it. They've also, by the way, been doing the right thing in their interactions with the Pentagon in refusing to allow their technology to be used to launch weapons without human control and engage in mass surveillance of U.S. citizens. But to answer your question, yeah, it is absolutely time for a federal framework to maintain both safety and competitiveness. And the White House needs to get moving on this. Congress does as well. As a member of the Homeland Security Committee, I absolutely want us to be briefed, even if it's in a classified setting, about this Mythos technology, what it can do, and this breach that apparently occurred.
Well, as we consider the threats posed by technology or just threats posed to the homeland in general, Congressman, I also wonder what your anticipation is to what is going to happen with Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. A FISA extension, obviously a short-term one, was passed by the House last week, but we're reaching deadline time once again. What will it take for you to vote to extend these surveillance powers? What reforms would you need to see, if any?
Yeah, so 702 is essential to helping to disrupt terror attacks against the United States. It has helped us disrupt terror attacks in the past. But unfortunately, under the current administration, we've seen a blatant disregard for the civil liberties of the American people. That was made manifest very visibly in the way that the Department of Homeland Security essentially invaded American neighborhoods with ICE raids, locked up U.S. citizens, locked up people without due process. And so I think the American people and members of Congress are right to ask for some assurance that this powerful 702 capability will be used in a way that maintains the civil liberties of American citizens. Again, foreign suspected terrorists, that's another matter entirely. I don't think there's any dispute that our intelligence agencies need to continue to maintain their ability to intercept communications of foreign persons of interest. But for U.S. citizens, we need some guardrails. So we'll see what comes in the next week or so. I know that a number of the leaders in this space in Congress are negotiating potentially a warrant requirement as it relates to U.S. persons. But we need to keep 702 going, but do it in a way that maintains the civil liberties of the American people. And unfortunately, the current administration has given us a lot of reasons not to trust them to use the tools at their disposal responsibly without congressional guardrails in place.
Congressman, we're seeing headlines on the situation in Iran, with the Iranian president saying that the blockade and threats by President Trump and the administration are the main obstacles to peace, and says Iran continues to welcome dialogue. All of this means, and we've got reporting now from the Washington Post, that it could take 6 months to clear the Strait of Hormuz, according to a Pentagon briefing to members of Congress. I'm looking at an average price for a gallon of gas right now at $4.02, up dramatically from where we were before the war began. If we extrapolate this and imagine a 6-month delay in getting this all fixed, what does that mean to somebody in your state who wants to get in the car and drive to Caserta Pizza for a Wimpy Skippy?
It's devastating, and good Rhode Island shout out there, by the way. But in all seriousness, President Trump broke his promise to the American people when he chose to get us involved in an unnecessary foreign war that is costing the American people a lot of money at the gas pump and is also costing innocent lives. The president seems to be more interested in launching foreign military action than in meeting the very real needs of the American people here at home. So now we got to figure out how we're going to get out of this mess. And I think we're all trying to work through that, but a few things are clear to me. First, the administration needs to rebuild our alliances with our allies, with our European allies, with allies across the Middle East. Instead of insulting them, we need to rebuild those relationships so that we can have a united front. Number two, fire Pete Hegseth already. Let's get the adults back in charge at the Pentagon, and let's recommit ourselves to diplomacy here, led by experienced negotiators, not the president's son-in-law. I think if we can get back to a higher degree of professionalism, we will figure out how to get ourselves out of this mess faster. But this is clearly a challenging situation that was unnecessary. We're in it now, and we got to find a way out.
Well, I was told by Senator Elizabeth Warren in a conversation we had with her last night, Congressman, that the clock on the 60 days the president has in terms of leeway via the War Powers Act is still ticking, even if we are in, quote unquote, a ceasefire, given the U.S. Navy is still maintaining this blockade. Are you hearing from your Republican colleagues as we approach the end of that 60-day window that something is going to change at that time? Could we see Congress step up to check the president in a more material way?
It may. Unfortunately, not enough of our Republican colleagues seem ready to stand up to the president on anything, even after all of the missteps that he has made. Listen, I think the legalese around the legality of the war and whether that 60-day clock is still ticking is a gray area. But what is not a gray area for me is that this war was a bad idea, that we shouldn't have gotten into it to begin with, and we need to push the president to diligently work to get us out of it in a responsible way. And I think that starts by putting, again, some adults in the room to engage in diplomacy and to manage our armed forces in a way that they are deserving of, because, tactically, our men and women in uniform have done a great job, but strategically, the leadership in the White House has failed them.
Congressman, I don't want to put you in a tough spot. We just have about 30 seconds left, but do you have a word to share on your late colleague, Congressman David Scott of Georgia, who we just learned passed away at 80?
Well, I didn't work with him closely, but I knew him a little bit. Great man, made history as the first Black American to chair the House Agriculture Committee, served his district in Georgia for 23 years. He will be dearly missed.
All right, we will leave it on that note. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us here on Bloomberg TV and Radio. Democratic Congressman Seth Magaziner of Rhode Island here with us on the early edition of Balance of Power. Of course, Joe, we'll be back at 5 p.m. Eastern, and we'll see how things move in the 3 hours between now and then.
Got to rise on Truth Social, and our ears, of course, always glued to what's happening coming out of the White House and Capitol Hill. We'll meet you back here on Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg.